I have so I guess they can get my upper rather not turn on. Very nice dinner.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, are you headed back tomorrow?
I am.
Okay.
I am. Yeah. Kind of promised I wouldn't. Stage.
Yeah.
Here we go.
And just turn it on and tap it and make sure it's working.
Oh yeah, we tested it before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You're
it's
awesome.
good.
Okay,
Now.
good. So I don't know if people told you, but we had like a resident fox this year on the ground.
No, I did
and
not
so
know.
it was one of those sort of disturbing. What happened is that they're doing this construction work on the pier out here.
Okay.
You see the cranes, right? And the
Yeah,
construction
right.
and the construction workers started feeding the foxes. So then the foxes got really used to people. And so we had one that was living on our grounds that it was kind of, at first you think it must be bad because it's just like,
Yeah.
but it wasn't. It just got so tame, right? Used to people. But then unfortunately, of course, being that tame, it got hit by a car.
Oh, I did not hear this.
Yeah, unfortunately. But it was kind of cool to see, like,
Yeah.
ignoring people, walking around.
Very cool. So I'll just wait down there then. I
Yeah.
guess.
I actually have to introduce
you a-
Mike Fishbein, who's introducing you. So.
Yeah, we got time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And people will still be quiet.
So between this and then when I switch the inputs, so it's okay. We got here 2 hours.
Hi there, if I could get everyone's attention. Welcome to the Falmouth Forum. So first of all, my name's Deepan Patel. I'm the director of the MBL. And Sebastian Lay, who you normally see up here, is on a plane right now. So let me substitute. But welcome, and we're very pleased that this is now the 30th year of the Falmouth Forum. And so we're very happy about that. And we're extremely grateful to the Falmouth Forum and Committee that runs these lectures and chooses speakers and helps us with this. And it's been a fantastic event all through the year. So we really appreciate that. And I wanted to also, some of you may notice that there's a crane out there and some trucks. And so just so you know what's happening, so we're fixing some of the roof. And so it's just sort of regular maintenance. So that'll be there for a few weeks. But we're trying to make sure that the handicap entrance side is always available. So if you're coming, continue, during other weekends and stuff like that, or Friday evenings, that'll be available. And then lastly, of course, my most important role is to tell you to silence your cell phones. So please take care of that. And then I will turn it over to Michael Fishbein, who's a member of the Falmouth Forum Committee, to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, well, thank you, Neepam. So, well, have a good crowd today. Good evening. It's kind of a cold evening, so nice to see everybody come out. So, as Neepam just said, my name is Mike Fishbein, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's forum. This is as Neepam just said, the 30th year that we've been doing this forum. So I think that's quite an incredible record right there. And these programs have been free to the Falmouth community, and we hope and intend to keep it that way. I think you can all agree that these programs have been very informative, intellectually challenging, sometimes even inspiring. And I think if you feel, as I do, that these programs are really valuable, you'll continue to support them by coming to them. But also, I'd like to make a little plea here to support our endowment. All of these programs, although free to the public, are obviously not free, and the majority of the funds come from our endowment. And our hope is to really expand the number of programs that we do over the next few years. And in order to do that, we do need to expand the endowment. And that means that we're going to, and I am right now, making a plea for you who enjoy these programs to contribute to the endowment. I believe when you came in, you were handed an envelope, and I hope so anyway. And if so, you can use that envelope to make a contribution and help support the Falmouth Forum. So anyway, these programs are supported by the Friends of the MBL, and I personally sit on a Falmouth Forum committee, along with Day Mount, Susan Morris, Yella Tima, John Collins, and Nancy Bridges. And on behalf of them, as well as myself, I'd like to thank you in advance for your generosity. So anyway, just a little bit about the talk. I don't really want to too tightly categorize this talk, because I think it's a broad and relevant talk, but it does touch on animal domestication. And, I read a little bit about animal domestication. I didn't realize how important it was. Really, it's one of, I think, mankind's most important contributions. Without domesticated animals, nomadic herders would not have aggregated into smaller communities, which eventually became the precursor to modern cities. But on a more personal note, maybe, the domestication means most to us in terms of the wolf. And all of the dogs that we now have, from the Dachshund to the Great Dane to the Alaskan Siberian or whatever, over 15,000 years, they all had the common ancestor as the wolf. And I think that's an incredible thing when you think about the variety. So anyway, I think one of the questions I had is, how did humans create such diversity within a single species thousands of years before anything was known about the processes governing genetic engineering, much less the intricacies of DNA? So in discussing his landmark book, How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog, tonight's speaker, Dr. Lee Dugatkin, will help us understand some of these processes. The New York Times said this about his book: it is part science, part Russian fairy tale, and part Russian spy thriller. This book reveals what can emerge from unfettered science if only we have the courage to let it unfold. So Lee is an evolutionary biologist and historian of science. He's a professor of biology and distinguished university scholar in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville. He's lectured about his research and his books at more than 175 venues around the world. He is the author of 9 books and more than 150 papers, appearing in the journals Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London. So it's my great honor to introduce this distinguished scientist, author, and speaker to you. So please join me in giving a warm MBL welcome to Dr. Lee Dugatkin.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. And thank you, Mike, for that wonderful introduction. I have been looking forward to this visit immensely. I want to thank the Falmouth Forum Committee and everybody who was involved in arranging this. And most importantly, I want to thank you for coming out on a cold, rainy night. I think the temperature dropped 25 degrees from when I left my hotel for dinner to now. But it does warm my heart to see so many people come out to hear a story of science. I've never been to Woods Hole before or the Marine Biology Lab, but I've done a bunch of research on the evolution of cooperation, and some of the really fundamental early work was done right at the MBL by people like Liley, but also Warner Clyde Ali and Whiteman and a bunch of other people. So it's just a thrill for me to be here. I'm going to start my talk with a question, which is this. Suppose that you could build the perfect dog. Right? What would be the key ingredients in your recipe? Well, you definitely want cute, right? Maybe something with floppy ears and a curly tail that wags in joy whenever you're around. You would like smart and loyal, and you definitely want unconditional love. Right? The thing is, you do not need to build this animal because for the last 6 decades, a dedicated team of Russian geneticists in Siberia have been building it for you. The perfect dog, except, as you might guess from the title of the talk, it's not a dog at all. It's a fox. It's a domesticated fox. They built it in the minus 40-degree winters of Siberia, but more importantly, they built it in the blink of an eye in terms of evolutionary time. Right? 100th of the time it took our ancestors to domesticate wolves into dogs. This is my friend and colleague and co-author, Lyudmila Trut. 2 weeks ago, Lyudmila turned 86 years old. And every day, including today, for the last 61 years, she has been leading what's come to be known as the silver fox domestication experiment. And I've had the honor for about the last 10 years or so to work with Lyudmila to try and tell this story to as broad an audience as we can. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you about foxes that will melt your hearts and lick your ears, just like this guy did 5 seconds after they put him into my arms in Siberia. But more than that, I'm going to tell you about cutting-edge science in the field of domestication. This fox domestication study is the gold standard for understanding this process of domestication. And as Michael hinted, domestication isn't only of interest to biologists and anthropologists, but it's of interest to everyone because when our ancestors began domesticating both animals and plants, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years ago, our own evolutionary trajectory as humans took a radically different turn than it would have otherwise. So this story starts with Dmitri Belyaev, who was my co-author Lyudmila's mentor. In the late 1930s, Belyaev was an undergraduate student at a place called the Ivanova Agricultural Academy outside of Moscow. And because it was an agricultural academy, he had all sorts of interactions with many, many domesticated species. And he was studying genetics there. When he graduated, like virtually every Soviet male of this era, he went off and he fought in World War II for 4 years. When he came back, he got a position as a research scientist at a place called the Central Research Laboratory for Fur Breeding Animals, also in Moscow. And it was here that Belyaev began to develop the ideas for what eventually would become the silver fox domestication experiment. They worked with a number of different fur breeding species at this institute, but the two most important by far were foxes and mink. And the reason these were so important was the Soviet Union was in dire straits. They were basically starving to death. And there were very, very few reliable sources of Western income flowing into the Soviet Union. But fox furs and mink furs were the exception. Now, when Belyaev was at the Central Research Lab working with these foxes, began to think about this process of domestication. He had worked with domesticated animals as an undergraduate. He had read Darwin's classic book on evolution and domestication. And Belyaev knew from all of this that many domesticated animals share a whole suite of characteristics. They tend to have things like floppy ears and curly tails. They tend to have low stress hormone levels. They tend to have lots of variation in their coat color. They tend to have juvenilized facial and body features compared to their wild ancestors. And they tend to have longer reproductive periods than their wild ancestors. Not every domesticated species has every one of those characteristics, but enough of them have a chunk of those characteristics that the whole suite of characters is known as the domestication syndrome. And Belyaev thought about it and he thought, this is really odd because our ancestors domesticated species for lots of different reasons. Some, like horses, we domesticated probably for transportation. Others, we domesticated as food sources. And yet others, like wolves into dogs, we domesticated for some combination of protection and companionship. And yet, no matter what we domesticate them for, they tend to show these characteristics in the domestication syndrome. Why? And Belyaev's hypothesis went like this. The one thing that our ancestors always needed when they began domesticating a wild species was to be working with animals that would not try and bite their heads off. And so he hypothesized that one important component of the early stages of all domestication events involved our ancestors choosing the calmest, friendliest towards human animals. He further hypothesized that somehow or another, and he really didn't know how, but somehow all of those other characteristics, the floppy tail, the floppy ears and the curly tail, the floppy ears and the curly tails, and the low stress hormone levels, and the juvenilized facial and body features, all of those somehow came along for the ride, that they were somehow genetically connected to friendliness for behavior. And Belyaev decided he would test this idea in real time using the foxes that he now knew so well from working at the Central Research Lab. And the idea at its core was simple. He envisioned an experiment where eventually he and a team would be testing hundreds and hundreds of foxes every year on how friendly or not they were towards humans. They would preferentially breed the friendliest animals. Foxes breed once a year, so every year is a generation. And they would do this generation after generation after generation. And Belyaev would test. First of all, were they in fact getting inherently calmer and friendlier towards humans? And also, were the other characteristics in the domestication syndrome beginning to appear if all you did was select on friendliness? So he has this idea, and it's beginning to congeal in the mid to late 40s. But Belyaev has a problem, and it is a really big problem. Right? Because any experiment like he's envisioning in domestication is an experiment in genetics. And at this time, it was essentially against the law to do modern, what's known as Mendelian genetics in the Soviet Union. And the reason it was against the law was because of this fellow right here, Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko was a fraud, a charlatan, a pseudoscientist who had risen up both in the scientific and equally importantly in the political ranks of the Soviet Union by arguing that Western Mendelian genetics was bourgeois science being promulgated by wreckers and saboteurs from the West. That instead, a long disproven idea known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics, he claimed it was not only correct, even though everybody knew it wasn't, it was also more in line with Soviet philosophy. And so he made up data to make it appear as if he was right. And by doing this, he not only rose up in the scientific hierarchy, but he literally became Stalin's right-hand man on science. This photo comes from a speech that Lysenko gave, one of his fire-spitting speeches where he's calling Western geneticists saboteurs and spies. And when he's done, Stalin stands up and yells out, "Bravo, Comrade Lysenko." Because of Lysenko, thousands of Soviet geneticists lost their jobs. Before him, the Soviet Union was a powerhouse in genetics. Hundreds of Soviet geneticists were thrown into prison, their crime being doing modern Mendelian Western genetics. And between 1 and 2 dozen Soviet geneticists were murdered by Lysenko's thugs. This is the environment in which Belyaev is planning out a large-scale experiment in genetics. Belyaev knows better than most just how dangerous this is, because one of those 1 to 2 dozen people that were murdered by Lysenko's thugs was Belyaev's older brother, who had been an up-and-coming geneticist. But Belyaev not only served in World War II for 4 years, he received endless medals for bravery. And this was a guy who was not scared of Lysenko. He knew he had to be careful because he would be working with lots of people who would help him. Right? But he was going to do it. And so he started off by working with a colleague of his on a tiny little pilot experiment. So because fox fur is such a good source of Western income coming into the Soviet Union, scattered across the Soviet Union were hundreds, maybe thousands of little farms where people were breeding foxes for their fur. And all these farms were owned by the Soviet government. Belyaev knew lots of people there in that little world. And he talked to somebody who ran one of these farms in Estonia. And he said, here's what I want to do. I'm going to start a little experiment. And he's going to test a couple of dozen foxes every year. And he's going to preferentially mate the ones that are friendliest towards humans. And they do this for about 5 years. Small sample size, but the results are promising. Even within that time, they're starting to see animals that are calmer and calmer. Now, Belyaev gets his big chance to start the full-blown silver fox domestication experiment in 1958, when he takes a position as vice director at a new institute for biology in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk. What had happened was that a large chunk of Soviet forest was cleared out to build a place called Akademgordak, or the Academic Village, which still exists today. It's a wonderful place. Khrushchev had worked with many leading Soviet scientists to do this, so they cleared out a section of the Siberian forest, and they built 24 world-class science institutes where they brought tens of thousands of people in, literally. Institutes in biology, chemistry, physics, early computer science, and so on. So Belyaev takes this vice director's position at the Institute for Biology, and he knows now that he's going to have the money and the power to start a full-blown silver fox domestication experiment. But what he's not going to have, because of all the administrative things he's going to have to do, is the time to be the person to lead the experiment on a day-to-day basis. So, right before he leaves Moscow to move to Novosibirsk, he goes on the hunt for a young scientist who can be the person to lead the experiment on a day-to-day basis. And to do this, he goes to Moscow State University, which is one of the best and also most beautiful universities in the world. And he talks to a colleague of his there who studies animal behavior, and he says what he wants to do. He wants to start this domestication experiment in foxes. And he begins interviewing people. Right? And one of the people who he interviews is 24-year-old Lyudmila. The interview happened in mid-1958, but if you talk to Lyudmila, she will tell you it feels to her like it happened yesterday. She remembers walking in, and the first thing that struck her was that Belyaev immediately began talking to her as an equal. Late 1950s Soviet science was very patriarchal. And here was the vice director of an institute talking to someone who was just finishing their undergraduate degree as an equal. That really mattered to her. And he lays out the idea. We're going to test 400, 500 foxes every year. We're going to choose the ones that are friendliest and calmest towards humans. We're going to preferentially breed them year after year. And then we're going to see, are we getting calmer and calmer animals? And are we beginning to see the other traits in the domestication syndrome appear? And Lyudmila loves this idea. She thinks the experiment is brilliant, and she's very excited about moving to this scientific oasis. But Belyaev stops her and says, you need to think about a few things. First of all, even though Lysenko is not as powerful as he used to be, if he wants to throw us in prison to make an example of us, he can. And Lyudmila knew that. Everybody who studied this knew it. But again, it mattered to her that Belyaev told her, take a deep breath. And the other thing he said was, I've done this little pilot experiment in Estonia, and things are promising. But this is an experiment in evolution. It could take 10 years before anything interesting happens. It could take 20 years. She remembers him looking her in the eyes and saying, it could take your whole life before something interesting happens. But she was hooked. Belyaev liked what he saw. So 6 months later, Lyudmila, her husband, and their 2-year-old daughter hop on a train from Moscow to Novosibirsk, which is no easy train ride, to start the full-blown fox domestication experiment. From day one, Lyudmila will tell you her motto comes directly from The Little Prince, right? When the fox tells the little prince that you become responsible forever for what you have tamed. So Lyudmila gets to Novosibirsk, to Akademgordak, the academic village. And they're ready to start the experiment. But Belyaev is still working on building a giant experimental fox farm where they can do it right there. But he doesn't quite have the money or the space yet. So for the first year or so, what Lyudmila does is she takes trains all over the Soviet Union to find another place to begin the experiment until they can move it permanently to Akademgordak. She settles on a place called the Lesnoy Fox Farm. It's an overnight 12-hour train ride from Akademgordak, and the plan is that Lyudmila will go down there 4 times a year, sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks and sometimes for 2 or 3 months. And she will start the full-blown experiment. Now, this place, Lesnoy, was a cash cow for the Soviet government. At any given time, 10,000 foxes could be at Lesnoy. And when Lyudmila first went down there and talked to the director of Lesnoy and said, we want to do this domestication experiment and breed friendly, calmer foxes to understand the process, he looked at her like she was nuts. I mean, why would anybody want to waste their time doing something like this? But when she said that Belyaev sent her, the director said, okay, fine. You can test 400 or 500 foxes. It's not going to bother me. So she begins the experiment. So every day she gets up at 6 o'clock and begins methodically going from cage to cage, testing foxes on their reaction to humans. And in any given year, she's going to test around 400 foxes, and she's going to test every one of them 2 times. Once when they're a pup or technically a kid, and once when they're an adult. And each time, this is what she does. She's going to score each of these foxes as she approaches their cage, as she stands by their closed cage, as she opens the door to their cage, and as she puts something, either a stick or her hand in a very, very thick glove, into the cage. And she's going to score them at each one of these stages, and again, twice during the development of each fox. And on a score of 1 to 4, where 4 means relatively calm and lower numbers mean relatively aggressive. She is then, every year, going to take the 10% of the males and the 10% of the females who have the highest calmness scores and preferentially breed them. The way that she describes the foxes at Lesnoy when she first began is as fire-breathing dragons. Most of them were extremely aggressive. And the ones that scored high on that scale were basically, they weren't particularly friendly. They were just not particularly aggressive. So they might be a little calm, but not very calm. So this is a relative score. That's the way it started. But even within 2 to 3 generations, they were seeing just a few foxes like this one here, whose name is Laska, which means gentle. These foxes were calm enough that Lyudmila could hold them in her arms. So she was optimistic that the experiment was worth continuing. So she goes down every year, 4 times a year, year after year, while they're trying to build this giant fox farm out at Akademgordak. And so 5 years later, and that's 5 generations, she has developed this new kind of scale. There are what Lyudmila calls class 3 foxes. And these are foxes that are either really aggressive or they flee from humans. And at this point, humans means her. She was doing the whole experiment at this point. Okay? There were class 2 foxes that were like Laska that I showed you on the last slide, that could be held but never showed any emotional responses. And then there were just a few, like about 2% of the foxes, who were what Lyudmila calls class 1 foxes. These were she could not only hold these animals, but they displayed emotions, right? They would wag their tails when Lyudmila approached. They would whimper and whine when she left. Now, at this point, 5 generations, 5 years into the experiment, maybe 2% of the foxes were in this category. Today, about 80% of the foxes in the experiment are in that category. Now, just a year later, she had to expand her classification system to include what she refers to as class 1E, or elite domesticated foxes. And here's how she describes these foxes in her own words. In the 6th generation, there appeared pups that eagerly sought contact with humans, not only tail wagging and whining and whimpering, but licking our hands in a dog-like manner. Of course, all of this is done with no training, no learning. What's more, some of the elite domesticated foxes were not only wagging their tails, they were wagging their curly tails. This was the first of the domestication syndrome traits to appear in the foxes. Remembering that who gets chosen to breed for the next generation is strictly based on behavior, not whether or not you have a curly tail. But now it was appearing at a very low frequency, and it increased over time. So a couple of more years go by. Now Lysenko is no longer a threat, and they've built the experimental farm about 20 minutes away from Akadem Gordak. Here's what it looks like on a nice day in the Siberian winter. Each one of these sheds can hold about 50 foxes, and at any given time, there might be 700 foxes or so on the farm. Now, this farm's existence was sort of a watershed moment for the experiment because it meant a couple of things. First of all, it meant that rather than being restricted to going down to Lesnoy 4 times a year, even if in total she was probably there 5 or 6 months, now she could be working with the foxes every single day. And what's more, she would have a team of people who would help her. Right? The other thing that was really critical from Lyudmila's perspective was now Belyaev was close by. When she was down at Lesnoy, he could come visit maybe once a year. And so she would have whatever time she had up in Akadem Gordak to talk with him. But now he was there all the time. So he could come out and visit, and she could talk with him about new ideas, which they did constantly. And if something really important and interesting happened, she could call Belyaev out to the farm, and he could be there in 20 minutes. A couple of years later, one of those important, interesting things happened, and her name was Dream. Dream was the first of the domesticated foxes with floppy ears. Okay? Now, here's the deal on foxes and floppy ears. In the wild, foxes have floppy ears till they're about 6 weeks old. And then their ears shoot ramrod straight, the way that you think of a fox, right? At 6 weeks, Dream's ears were still flopping. At 2 months, they were flopping. At 3 months, they were flopping. At 4 months, they were flopping. Lyudmila calls Belyaev out, and he looks at Dream, and he turns to her and he says, "What kind of wonder is this?" He would take slides of Dream with him when he was giving talks. And these talks now were not only in the Soviet Union, he was beginning to go around the world talking about it. So he'd have Dream up there, and he would come back from a conference, and he would tell Lyudmila that people in the audience would come up to him afterwards and accuse him of sticking up a picture of a dog puppy to convince them that the experiment was working. That's how much Dream looked like a dog. So now, strictly based on selecting for calm behavior, some of the foxes display curly tails and floppy ears. All right, so we have to get through 61 years, so let's fast forward a little bit. 1974. By this time, the domesticated foxes had 50% lower stress hormone levels than wild foxes, and also 50% lower than a control line of foxes that they now had as part of the experiment. The control line was tested exactly like all the other foxes, except who bred and who didn't breed had nothing to do with behavior. So it's a wonderful comparison. Domesticated foxes, 50% lower stress hormone levels. What's more, by this time, they were beginning to see all sorts of other things appear strictly as a result of selecting for behavior. The domesticated pups, particularly the elite ones, were opening up their eyes a day earlier than typical foxes and wild foxes. They were responding to sounds 2 days earlier than wild foxes. Lyudmila would joke around and say that while this was happening, they used to sit around over tea and say that it almost seemed like the domesticated foxes just could not wait to start interacting with humans. Another thing that they noted was that the elite domesticated females had slightly longer reproductive seasons. So remember, that's another one of the characteristics in the domestication syndrome. Domesticated animals tend to have longer reproductive periods than their wild ancestors. Typically, foxes in the wild mate for about 10 days, kind of late February-ish, or late January through February. The domesticated foxes were in reproductive state for about 14 days. So not dramatically longer, but significantly longer. Another one of the traits in the domestication syndrome. They were also seeing all sorts of weird, funky things happen with their fur. Yet again, another classic trait in the domestication syndrome. And in particular, there was this bizarre white star-shaped pattern that would often appear on the foreheads of the domesticated foxes. Right? If any of you are horse people, you know that there are some breeds of horses that are like this, and it's actually not uncommon in domesticated animals. And now the foxes were showing it. And on and on. So at this point, Lyudmila and Belyaev expand the experiment even further. Now they're going to continue selecting the 10% of the males and females that are the calmest, but now they're going to create another line in their experiment. Now they are also going to have a line of foxes that are the 10% of the nastiest, most aggressive towards humans. And the reason they're going to do this is not because they're really all that interested in aggression, but they think that this aggressive line will help them understand their domesticated foxes. And that could happen in lots of ways, but I want to focus on one. This experiment, right, it's an experiment in genetics, like I said, but it's an experiment in a particular type of genetics called behavioral genetics, because what you're selecting for is behavior, in this case, calm, friendly behavior to humans. So whenever you do a behavioral genetics experiment, you're always worried about something. You're always worried that non-genetic factors may be influencing what you're seeing. So their assumption all along, and we'll come back to this later, but their assumption all along is that all the changes we've been talking about are due to genetic changes. But maybe non-genetic factors play a role here. So for example, maybe pups learn whether to be friendly towards humans or not by watching their parents. Or maybe the kind of hormonal cocktail that you're exposed to during development may affect whether you're friendly or not towards humans. These are quote unquote non-genetic factors. And the only way to know whether they're important or not is to do an experiment. These experiments are often called transplant experiments or common garden experiments. Except in this case, the common garden is going to be the uterus of a fox. So here's what Lyudmila did. They basically want to try and rule out these non-genetic factors. So what she has are pairs of foxes. And each pair, and there are I think 5 or 6 of these pairs, and each pair is made up of a pregnant aggressive fox and a pregnant domesticated fox. Right? And despite the fact that no one had ever tried this with a mammal this big, Lyudmila learned the detailed surgical procedures necessary to do the following. Here's what the uterus of a pregnant fox looks like. And so there are typically 6 or 7 developing embryos. Right? When the embryos were way less developed than this, here they're already attached, but when they were 1 week old, like microscopic, you could barely see them in a drop of water. When they were 1 week old, what Lyudmila did was she swapped half of the developing embryos from the uterus of the aggressive fox, moved them over to the uterus of the domesticated fox, and vice versa. So now each of the pregnant females was carrying her genetic offspring, but about half of the offspring were foster offspring from the other kind of female. So this is the perfect experiment to do, to look at the possibility of non-genetic factors. And because here's what you do. When the foxes give birth, right, you look at how the pups behave towards humans right away. right? Do they behave like their genetic mother, regardless of what uterus they happen to develop in, suggesting genetic factors, or do they behave like their foster mother, suggesting non-genetic factors? So she's got 5 or 6 pairs of these pregnant females, and she does what I just described here. But she does have a little problem, which is that when she's moving those 1-week-old embryos from one to the other, she knows who's who. But how is she going to know who are the genetic offspring and who are the foster offspring when the mother gives birth? The answer is provided by the foxes themselves, because coat coloration is a very well understood genetic trait in foxes. And so essentially what Lyudmila did was she color-coded the parents, right? In some of the cases, she would have a dark-furred aggressive and a light-furred domesticated, and in other cases, the opposite, so that whatever color the fur of the pups was, she knew who their genetic mother was. So she waits. Foxes are pregnant for about 9 weeks or so, and when they're about to give birth, it's actually the workers in the experiment who were there to report to Lyudmila that the foxes had given birth. So I really want to just take 1 second, because there's a group here that never gets credit for being part of this experiment. You know, anytime you have 700 foxes, there's a lot of feeding and cleaning and veterinary, medical things. And the workers are basically the ones that are doing the daily stuff like that. And these workers were almost all female. And they tended to come from fairly poor families, from local villages. But they were so loyal to the experiment. They didn't exactly know all the details. They knew the basics, but they knew, because of all the people that were starting to come and visit, that this was important science. And so when these females gave birth and the workers found out, they ran to Lyudmila's office with wine and cake to announce that the pups had been born. Okay, so what happened? So they about 2 weeks old, they can start walking, and Lyudmila is there watching. And I'm going to let her describe it in her own words, what she saw. And what we're going to see here is her description of the pups born to an aggressive female, right? Some of them are her genetic offspring, and some of them are her tame offspring. The pattern that you're going to see here was true for all the aggressive foxes, and also the equivalent was true for the tame foxes. But I'm just going to show you one story. So here's Lyudmila describing what happens. It was fascinating, she says. The aggressive mother had both foster offspring and her genetic offspring. Well, that wasn't the fascinating part. That was what she set up, okay? Her foster tame offspring were barely walking, but if there was a human standing by the cage, they were already rushing to the cage doors and wagging their tails and licking her hands. She, the mother, was punishing her foster tame pups for such, I love this phrase, improper behavior. This is not the way you behave if you're a proper aggressive fox. She growled at them, grabbed them by the neck, threw them into the corner of the nest, and what did they do but get up, walk over to the cage door, and start licking Lyudmila's hand? They behaved like their genetic mother, not like their foster mother. Okay, so now, what about the genetic offspring in that same clutch? What did they do? Again, in Lyudmila's words, and I just adore the way she describes this. They retained their dignity, growling aggressively the same as their mothers, and running to their nests, providing really, and again, this was true for the aggressive fox, it was true for the domesticated fox, providing really strong evidence that the changes they were seeing were due to genetic changes. Now, by this time in the mid-70s, it was clear that the experiment was not only working, but it was really working faster than Belyaev and Lyudmila ever dreamed it could. Within 15 generations, they had seen all the things that we had talked about already. So, at this point, Lyudmila goes to Belyaev's office with this audacious idea. She says, there's this tiny little house on the experimental farm. I want to move in there with one of the domesticated females and live with them 24/7 the way that we live with our dogs, and equally importantly, the way that our ancestors would have lived with proto-dogs during the domestication process. And I'm going to take notes on everything that happens. Yes, it's a sample size of 1. Yes, it's an anecdotal thing, but maybe it'll tell us something interesting. So Belyaev loves the idea, and Lyudmila has the perfect fox in mind. Fox's name is Pushinka, which means tiny ball of fuzz. And from the time that Pushinka was old enough to walk, she was the friendliest of all the foxes in the experiment up to that date. And Lyudmila knew she was going to be the one. But Lyudmila waited until Pushinka was a year old, because that's when they first mate and breed. And Lyudmila bred her with an elite domesticated male. And she moved into the house right before Pushinka was due. And the reason she did this was she thought, now I can take notes not only on what Pushinka does, but on what pups who from the moment they're born are interacting with humans. Again, the way that dog pups do and the way that proto-dog pups would have done with our ancestors. Here's the only picture we have of Pushinka being petted here by Belyaev. So this is the experimental house, and it still exists today. But if you go inside, so what is it, 45 years later. But if you go inside today, it's rubble. Okay? And the reason I'm showing you a room full of rubble is this. The first time I went in 2012, in January, it was minus 40 degrees, and the snow was up to here. Lyudmila is up to here, and she was 79 years old. She insisted upon walking me into the house and took me from room to room, telling me stories about, this is where Pushinka used to play ball with me. This is where she used to hop on my bed and sleep with me. They moved in on April 6, 1974. Pushinka gives birth to 6 pups, including this little guy, Pushak, which is the male version of Tiny Ball of Fuzz. And Lyudmila is living with them, taking notes on everything they do. So they're living together for 3 months. And on the night of July 15th, something happened that changed Lyudmila forever. So this picture was taken by me when I was there in January. But in July, Siberia is very hot. It can get to be 90 degrees. On the other side of this house, there's a little bench. And every night in the summer, Lyudmila would sit out there and relax at the end of the day around 6 or 7 o'clock with a book. And when she did, Pushinka would be lying by our side the way that your dog would be, and Lyudmila would be petting her. So every night around 6 or 7 p.m. when this happened, there was a watch person who would come around the farm just to make sure everything was okay. And they had just hired a new watch person that nobody knew, that Lyudmila did not know and that Pushinka did not know. So on the night of July 15th, this watch person is approaching Lyudmila and Pushinka in a they're moving in a pretty brisk pattern, and what might be interpreted as an aggressive way, coming very quickly towards him. And Lyudmila looked down, and she couldn't believe what was happening. Pushinka had jumped up, began charging towards the night watch person and barking at them exactly the way that a guard dog barks, and exactly the way that no fox in the history of the experiment had ever barked before. Now, Lyudmila's first thought was, Pushinka's protecting me. But then she said, wait a minute. I'm a trained scientist. I know how easy it is to fall into that anthropomorphism trap of thinking the animal's doing what you would do in that situation. But then something else happened, which was that when Lyudmila began walking over to the guard and talking to them in a calm way, and it was clear that she was not in danger, Pushinka stopped barking, gently strode back over to the bench, lay down, and waited for Lyudmila to come over and start petting her again. Is it possible Pushinka wasn't protecting her? Of course it's possible. But the key question here was just how domesticated had the animals become in these 15 years? And Pushinka gave her the answer. And Lyudmila will tell you that from that night forward, after Pushinka did that, she knew she would never leave the experiment. She never has. So let me just quickly tell you 5 minutes more of some of the things they've been doing. I mentioned that in the mid-70s, they had seen that the domesticated foxes had slightly longer reproductive periods. But in 1983 and 1984, something really remarkable happened. Many domesticated species not only have longer reproductive periods, but instead of breeding just once a year like their ancestors, they breed multiple times like dogs. Wolves only breed once, dogs breed many times. In 1983 and 1984, there were a handful of the elite females who went into estrus, were ready to breed a second time during the year. Not just in the typical late January, February period, but a second time in September. And one of those years, Lyudmila was able to mate some of those females with elite males, and they produced a second clutch of pups. Unheard of. Not only unheard of in the experiment, but unheard of, period. All of these changes, strictly as the result of selecting for calm behavior, pro-social behavior towards humans. So in the 80s and 90s, they began working with people who had very sophisticated equipment that allowed them to measure faces and bodies. And they found two striking things about their domesticated foxes. First of all, the domesticated foxes have a rounder, shorter, more dog-like snout. You know, one of the things you think of when you think of foxes in the wild is this really long, pronounced snout. Domesticated foxes, much more juvenilized compared to wild foxes. Rounder, shorter. The other thing that you might think of when you think of a wild fox are those gracile limbs that they're running around on. The domesticated foxes are kind of a little chunkier and lower to the ground than wild foxes. As the years went by and molecular genetic tools became more available, Lyudmila and team were very interested in using these things to help them understand their foxes. So in the late 90s, a Russian geneticist who had worked with dogs, her name was Anna Kukova, approached Lyudmila and said, I have the tools now that will allow us to do a lot of molecular genetic work with these foxes. And I'd like to come work with you. And Anna learned what everybody who works with Lyudmila learns, which is that if she thinks that you can help her understand these foxes, that she will not only work with you, but she will work with you at a pace that will make your head spin. Before Anna knew it, Lyudmila had this assembly line of workers ready to take blood from 300 foxes, get it back overseas and analyzed. And so they did this. And over the years now, this was starting in the early 2000s, they've done lots and lots of things. The first thing they did, and in many ways one of the most interesting, was they started off by asking a very simple question. They've got all these changes we've been talking about. So deep down at the molecular genetic level, are those changes kind of scattered across the fox's genome, across different chromosomes and all over the place? Or are they clustered together in kind of hot spots? And what they found was that many of the changes could be traced to changes at one Fox chromosome number 12. For the biologists, there were a bunch of QTLs here. So this is interesting. It means it's localized. More interesting was at the same time, dog geneticists were asking the same question about dog domestication. Foxes and dogs have different numbers of chromosomes, quite radically different. But essentially, parts of Fox chromosome 12 are spread across 3 dog chromosomes. And what the dog geneticists found was that many, not all, but many of the changes associated with dog domestication were also found on the equivalent dog chromosome. Right? So even deep down at the molecular genetic level, it looks like they're mimicking what happened during the domestication of wolves to dogs. Right? Last example I'm going to give you. of one of the things they found. This may be my favorite of all the things in the domesticated foxes, although it's probably the one we understand least about. Right? Before I tell you what it is, though, I want to tell you why it's my favorite. The first one is this trait that I'm going to tell you about did not appear in the domesticated foxes till about the year 2000. About the year 2000. That means the experiment was going on 40 plus years before this new characteristic emerged. Any one of us who worked on a particular system in biology for 30 years would start to expect getting lifetime achievement awards, and we would not have worked nearly long enough to see this trait. The other reason I love this trait is that it is hard to imagine a more perfect thing for a domesticated, pet-like organism to have. So here's the story. A Russian animal behaviorist by the name of Svetlana Gogolova was studying vocalizations and communication in non-humans. And Svetlana reached out to Lyudmila and said, I'd like to come to the farm and record the kinds of sounds and vocalizations that the domesticated foxes make, that the aggressive foxes make, that the control line of foxes make. And Lyudmila says, fantastic. So Svetlana comes year after year and she gathers 2,000 hours of sounds made by the domesticated, made by all the foxes, domesticated, aggressive, and control. And basically there are like 8 different sounds across all those animals. But 2 of the sounds, and I'm going to focus on one of them, are only made by the domesticated animals. They're made by virtually all of the domesticated foxes from the time when they're pups, but no other foxes in the experiment make this sound. And here's what it is. There is no non-human sound that is closer to laughter than that sound. And you can measure that. You can take human laughter, put it up on a spectrogram, it's called. Take that sound, put it up on a spectrogram. Nothing is closer. So now, right, you not only have lapdog-like, friendly, cute foxes, but you have foxes that will laugh with you when you're laughing. They will laugh with you when you're crying. They will laugh with you when you're throwing things across the room because, of course, they're not laughing at all. Now, so it's almost too perfect for a domesticated pet animal to have. Now, this is the trait that they understand the least, but they're working on it. They're trying to figure out what's going on here. So if you ask Lyudmila today, 61 years into the experiment, what our hopes and dreams are for the future, I got a 6-hour answer that I will distill down to 2 key points. The first thing that Lyudmila says is that I hope it's possible to register them as a new pet species. So there are actually about 24 of these living in people's houses around the world as pets. They're very expensive, like a pedigree animal. All the money goes to the experiment. But the thing is that technically they are still considered exotics. And what that means is that the rules for whether you can have one vary from country to country, from state to state, from city to city, from subdivision to subdivision. But there is, in fact, a process that you can go through at the international level to get an animal certified as a house pet. And they're working on that because they have plenty of foxes that they could keep the experiment going on and still put 100 or 200 of these foxes in people's houses. And they know that they have created a new domesticated pet-like organism. Right? The other thing that Lyudmila will tell you is, one day I'll be gone, but I want my foxes and the experiment to live forever. I do. I hope you do. And I appreciate you taking the time out to hear this tonight. Thank you very much. So there are are some domesticated foxes running around in the snow for you.
We'll take a few questions.
That was a fantastic lecture. I think
thank you very
everybody
much.
appreciated it.
And I'm happy to answer as many questions as you want. And I'm also mentioning they have copies of the book outside if you want. No pressure at all. But if you want me to sign, I'm happy to, just so you know. Question, yes.
Yeah, I'm a little bit curious on the differences within a single lead litter, because they'll have multiple cups and so on.
Right.
And is there any epigenetic effects that they've observed now that you look at the molecular components?
Sure. Yeah. So the question, right? Did people hear the question? Okay. Good. Okay. So there is quite a bit of variation even within pup litters, right? But of course, at the end of the day, what they're choosing are the ones that are the calmest for one line. And in terms of epigenetics, that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What I can tell you is that some of the genetics I didn't have time to get into demonstrate really nicely that many of the changes that you see in the domesticated foxes are basically associated with genes turning on and off at different points. And that's one type of epigenetics, right? Basically, what they're finding is that they're expressing juvenilized traits in a way that wild foxes don't. They're expressing them for longer periods. I will say just on that note that I want to give Belyaev some credit here. In the 1940s, when he was first conceptualizing this idea, there was no field of epigenetics. And there was no language even to use to describe what we're talking about today. But when you read Belyaev's writings from then, we had it translated. It's really remarkable. He's describing what he thinks is going to happen, and much of it is associated with when genes are going to turn off and turn on in the process. And he thinks this is critical for domestication. As someone who's sitting there reading it, it's unbelievably frustrating because you're like, say it, but of course there was no language that really allowed him to do it. But he thought that, and it turned out to be right.
I had a question about, you kept saying they selected for behavior.
Right.
But then they got the ears, they got the tail, and throughout your talk, I still have trouble understanding why do the tail and the ears come about?
It's a great question. Let's see. I don't know if we have time to get into the answer in detail, but let me give you a 1 minute answer because this is something a lot of people wonder about. So here's what we think is happening. There's this hypothesis called the neural crest hypothesis. So neural crest cells are like stem-like cells. They can develop into almost anything. And very, very, very early in development, they migrate across this thing called the neural crest to all different parts of the body. Well, it turns out that developmental biologists knew that selecting for calmness and low stress levels changes the number of neural crest cells that are migrating during early development. Okay, so that's the key bit. And the thing is that the neural crest cells migrate into all sorts of areas like floppy ears where they manifest themselves as cartilage. You have less neural crest cells turning into cartilage in those ears, and you have floppier ears. You have fewer neural crest cells migrating to the tail, and that causes the tail to flip. Yes, fewer, and they also migrate slightly differently. What I can say in summary is that almost, but not all, of the traits in the domestication syndrome can be explained by the neural crest cells. So you select for calmness and tameness, you reduce the number of neural crest cells, and that manifests itself in most of the characteristics of the domestication syndrome. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There's other things going on, but that's the crux of it. Yeah. Thank you, because I wanted to say that, but I thought I was going on too long as it was. Yeah.
Hi.
So I'm wondering about cognitive changes in the animals, and like a very rare ability in the animal world is I can do this and you will look there. Now my dog can't do that, a very domesticated creature, but has that kind of skill been tested in these creatures?
Let me just say, first of all, I did not pay this person to ask me this question. They did an amazing experiment on this. Dogs are, like you say, extremely good at following gaze and touching and pointing. But most animals are actually horrible at it. Well, a fellow by the name of Brian Hare, who's at Duke University, went and spent time with the foxes doing this experiment, asking, are they capable of following gaze and pointing? And the answer is that domesticated foxes are. The aggressive foxes and the control foxes are completely clueless. Okay? Not only can the domesticated foxes do this, but they compare the results to dogs, and the domesticated foxes are just as good as dogs. That's the one thing that they actually have a sense of in terms of learning and cognition. And it's an incredible thing because, like I say, most animals are really awful. I mean, you can train them, but they don't inherently do that. Foxes do it inherently, like dogs. I'm supposed to pick people who have the mic, so yeah. Yes.
You said it was going on for 60 years, so that's a lot of foxes, and only 10% were chosen for the breeding of the next year. What happens to all the other foxes?
Well, darn, I was trying to stay away from some of the dark side. So the answer is this, that you're right. This is a lot of foxes every year. And some of the foxes that are not used in the experiment are used in other experiments that are going on at Akademigorda. Some are used in kind of public outreach stuff. Some live in people's houses. But there are a real number that are actually turned into pelts. And the money goes to the experiment, which they desperately need that money. I have to tell you, though, I mean, I talked to Lyudmila at length about this. And she will tell you that time of year when that happens is extraordinarily difficult on them. They do not take that lightly. It's very, very difficult for them to do it. They say they've had workers and people on the experiment who basically have had to seek psychological help because, I mean, these are pet-like animals. But the truth is, you can't have an experiment like this with every generation having hundreds of animals that you're choosing, but not have the kind of problem that I just went through. So it's unfortunate. They don't like it. It troubles them, but it does happen.
Sir, can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. I didn't see you up there. Yes.
Quite all right. On a political note.
On a political note.
This type of research.
Right.
Was it in any way affected by the changes with the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, that type of thing?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and the answer is absolutely. So basically, there were two bottlenecks in the experiment. One was when the Soviet Union fell and broke apart, and the other one was about 10 years later, the ruble had a dramatic decrease. In both those cases, funding for the experiment virtually dried up. And that was true when the Soviet Union broke up for lots of science. But like if you're doing work where you can freeze your samples, it's one thing. But if you have to feed and take care of 700 foxes, you can't put everything on hold. They got through those periods because basically they had stored some money up from beforehand, but equally importantly, Lyudmila and the whole team of people put their personal resources into the experiment. In the book, we talk about these stories where Lyudmila would literally stand on the roads outside the Akademgordak and stop cars going by and ask them for money and food so they could keep the experiment going. And somehow or another, they managed it in both those bottlenecks. And then after that, things got much better because that was also around the time when people around the world were starting to pay attention to this. And so they began to build up collaborations with people in the U.S. and in Europe, and so over the years they've actually gotten some money from the National Institutes of Health and the European Science Agency. But there were those bottlenecks, and they were very difficult. Yes.
Can the domesticated foxes survive in the wild?
Can the domesticated foxes survive in the wild? I can only give you my best guess, which is they would have no trouble. They would have no trouble. We don't know because, of course, they're fanatics about making sure that there's no interaction with wild foxes because of disease problems, right? So they don't know. If they've never released any of these into the wild. It's something you would really want to think about in terms of the ethics. But based on what they do and the way they interact with each other and the way that domesticated foxes, for example, interact with aggressive foxes, they interact fine with them. The aggressive foxes are aggressive towards humans, but they're not any more aggressive towards other foxes than the domesticated fox. So everything that we know suggests they would do perfectly fine in the wild, but it's never been done, so I have to put that caveat. Yes?
In the course of the inbreeding experiments for the affectionate foxes, I don't believe I heard any mention of the difference between male and female. Was there a difference in the
Sure.
between the males and the females?
Right. So let me just be clear about something, though. Inbreeding is a word that has very negative connotations. They were very careful that they did not have genetic relatives breeding with each other and having inbreeding problems. Now, or maybe you were just saying inbreeding. I'm not sure. Okay, but the answer in terms of males and females is, this is why I was like being clear that they were choosing the 10% of the males and the 10% of the females. On average, females had higher pro-social towards human scores than males did. But of course, it's right. And in fact, the way I described some of the changes in domesticated foxes was that they were displaying more juvenilized characteristics. They were also displaying more feminized characteristics. So what I mean here is just that the domesticated foxes look more like female wild foxes than the aggressive foxes and the control foxes. But yes, there were differences. Females were on average calmer, but that's why they still took the 10% of the males, even though those scores were on average higher, and that's what they did it.
I don't know exactly the timeline between the domestication of cats and dogs, but one thing I've always wondered is, in the context of this domestication syndrome, dogs seem to have a plasticity of traits that I don't see in cats. For example, size. We have dogs as small as Chihuahuas and big as St. Bernards, and yet why don't we see a similar scale of, no matter how, I don't know if any, it's just for lack of trying, but we don't have cat Chihuahuas and cat Great Danes and that species. Is that inherent to the species itself, that those alleles don't travel with tameness, or why isn't that the case?
Yeah. So I first I should say I'm not an expert on cat domestication. There are people that argue that they're really only semi-domesticated, and I don't say that jokingly. That's what But the answer, my best guess to an answer would be, first, part of it is that there hasn't been the concerted effort that has been applied to create these dog breeds. But I think another factor would be the ancestral condition. So remember, wolves are hefty creatures. The ancestors of domesticated foxes were not that big. They were much, much smaller. So I think inherently it's going to be harder to get much, much bigger cat breeds, whereas, it's different when you start with something large and you breed down. It's probably easier than the other way. That's my best estimate. There's a fellow, keep an eye out in the next year or so. There's an evolutionary biologist by the name of Jonathan Losos at Washington University who's writing a book on cats and cat domestication that may have much more on that.
So we're going to take one more question.
Of course.
But I just want to let everyone know that Lee's going to be out in the lobby signing books, and you can certainly stop by, purchase the book, have him sign it, and ask more questions. But this is one more question.
Okay, sure.
Exotic pets are a big problem in this, particularly in this country, and I wondered if where these foxes go, whether the families or the people to whom they're sold, whether they're very carefully vetted before the fox goes into a home.
Yeah, so, well, I don't know that I would say that the people are vetted. I mean, there's a filtering process here in the sense that these foxes can be $5,000 to $8,000, like a real high-end pedigree dog. So at that level, there is some filtering about who can get these foxes. But that doesn't mean that people who have money aren't going to be nasty to the foxes. It just means that's one thing that's filtering who can get these foxes. My understanding is that, like I say, there's a couple of dozen that live in people's houses. They're all neutered before they leave the farm, so that people cannot breed these things on their own. Now, this is where if they get that classification to be a house pet, this is where these issues are going to really rise to the surface. Because if they really put a couple of hundred foxes in people's houses every year, there are going to be mistakes. And some of those foxes are probably going to be able to breed even if they thought they correctly neutered them. And then there's nothing you could, once that happens, what are you going to do? So I think they are concerned in the long run about that problem, but it's not here yet because they haven't come anywhere near close to that. But it is an ethical issue that I think down the road they'll have to deal with. Okay, well, thank you so much again for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. Right. Okay.
I live at Company's Medical Institute.
Oh, okay.
We have a film production company. I'm an executive producer there. I'm John Rubin. Do you have a film is there a film stir here? I know even friends of mine have made films on this topic before.
There is not. I would love to talk with you about it. My wife already has Sally Field picked out as Lyudmila.
Well,
I know. I understand.
But anyway, so here's